Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. This video will be reviewing the DM supplement and adventure, Calpurnia's Guide to Practical Traps, designed by Kelley for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider using my affiliate links for your DM's Guild shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/RogueWatson. Shoutouts to Platinum patrons Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Nick R, Andy, Chris, Manuel, and Basil, and Gold patrons RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy Numa, Marcos Did Vicente, Gilberto, Sean A.K., Cert to be Adam Tethers, Lounge, Sam, Ross, Lumpy Spuds, Jerome, Fatboy619, Skalenia, and Nick C. Thank you all very much for your support. This is not the first, and probably won't be the last, specific supplement based around using traps. This is, I think, the only one that includes an entire adventure. So this guide is over 50 pages long, and half of that is a full-fledged adventure that is included in a guidebook about traps. And yes, obviously the adventure is very much focused about traps. I actually have mixed feelings on the adventure itself, which is kind of a bummer because, you know, with something like this, you don't even expect an adventure. So it's hard to be too critical about it when it's just kind of all bonus material, but that's my job here, is to be critical of all these products. So the traps themselves, I think it's less about providing new and zany trap ideas and more about kind of listing a lot of basic traps that you would find in more practical circumstances. So you know, tripwires and you know, the classic like logs swinging down or the bucket on the door, you know, all those. There are some magical traps in here as well. In fact, I think the most exciting section is actually the illusion traps, which might be a bit of a grammatical thing here, because these are all, you know, adjective traps. So mechanical trap, alchemical trap, magic trap. I guess it should be magical trap then, shouldn't it? An illusory trap, maybe, instead of illusion trap. But anyway, the illusory traps are probably my favorite in here because they do a really fun way of implementing illusion spells from the School of Illusion, like Major Image, and I think there was Programmed Illusion, Magic Mouth, all these different things you can use either as a player or as an enemy could actually utilize these pretty clever ideas. So I thought that whole section was pretty interesting. But it's just very well detailed. Like, you know, for every single trap it lists the triggering mechanisms that could be used, the countermeasures, how to craft these particular traps, which they all have different rules for crafting. The crafting rules are a little bit fiddly, and I hate to blame this supplement because I don't think D&D 5th edition has good crafting rules in general. And it might be above and beyond for any supplement that's not specifically about crafting to try and create their own crafting system. So what I would probably do is just say, if you have proficiency in you know, whatever kind of toolkit, use like an artisan's tools or, you know, poisoner's kit, whatever kind of trap you're making, and I would look and see what your proficiency bonus is and what your stat is. Basically, instead of rolling a skill check, I would just say, hey, if you've got the components and you've got the right skill number, the actual just whatever your final modifier is, then I would just let you craft the trap. Because I think what's most unfulfilling is the fact that you have to roll a skill check and then that determines like success or failure, even though you've already got the materials. And then what, you know, it just says, well, you can just keep repeating that, but if you fail hard enough, then maybe you can lose some of your material. You know, it just gets a little too fiddly, so I would come up with a slightly different system. But I'm not necessarily blaming this supplement for not having a wholly enjoyable crafting system. I do appreciate that their rules are there, and I appreciate that the components are listed basically as just a gold cost, which is ultimately what I want. Like, it's, you know, for each one it lists, you know, you'll need this, this, and this, and the important thing is it comes down to, you know, 50 gold or 75 gold or 100 gold. Like, I don't, you know, I don't necessarily am going to be nitpicky about you have to have each of these items, but if you just want to say, hey, I go into town, I want to make, you know, supplies for these traps, then say, okay, you need to spend this much money. That is way more simpler, makes a lot more sense. So I'm glad that that's there and that they all include those kind of rules. They also include rules for variance, which is something, by the way, if you recognize the name Calpurnia, that was a previous supplement that I reviewed. I believe it was 2 years ago, Calpurnia's Lesser Magical Items or something like that, which was very much formatted and looked similar to this. And it also used a similar system with variants, which is every magic item had different variants that they could come in, or cursed. They could be cursed in certain ways. And in this case, different traps could come in different variants. So, for example, a spike trap it could be diseased, or it could be poisoned, or it could involve a Venus flytrap, which is kind of like basically sticky instead of doing damage. Which is a nice way of adding variety to all these different traps. You've got your base trap, and then you can add different modifiers and modifications on top of that, which is pretty nice. But as you can see, it's practical traps. These are not big, complex, confusing traps, which I think I can appreciate. A clever DM can obviously take these and then run with it, or maybe even combine, combine 2 or 3 of these traps into a more complicated trap, and thus make it a complex trap. But I think in general, this does a good job of putting basic, maybe more like tier 1 style traps that you'd be coming across, which I think is the more effective way of doing a trap guide. I wanted to point out a few highlights. So I already talked about the spike pit variants, the countermeasures for the poison gas trap. I really like the way all the countermeasures are spelled out in this case. A successful DC 15 perception check notices ventilation holes or staining on nearby surfaces from the noxious gas. A successful dexterity check using thieves' tools can disable the trap mechanism, but if you fail it by 5 or more, then that will actually trigger the trap. And it is possible to block the trap's ventilation points to stifle the gas cloud. At the DM's discretion, this halves the cloud's radius or gives advantage on any poison saving throws, or both. So I'm glad that all of these different things are spelled out and kind of explained, and each of these traps gets appropriate countermeasures that allows PCs to basically either detect them as well as trying to thwart them in different ways, which I think is definitely what I'm looking for. One of my favorite spell ideas is under magic traps, and this is from a primed spell scroll. So again, even all the magic traps aren't very complicated. It's using tools that are already available even to players. So in this case, the primed spell scroll, which is a really fun idea, essentially an enemy, or again, a player could do this too, reads through an entire scroll except for like the last word, so not to trigger it, and then uses the illusory script spell to then put that word over the entire spell scroll, so it looks like it's just a scroll that has that single word posted on it that anybody can read. And the idea is some hapless adventurer comes across it, sees, a word just on a scroll, and then hopefully they'll say that word out loud, and then that's what triggers the actual spell scroll that's been primed. So I think that's a really, really fun idea. It even says spell scrolls are activated in red. Normally the scroll's owner reads the scroll from start to finish to activate its power. However, it is possible to read to the penultimate word and leave the last to an unfortunate victim to read. Basically, this is the magical trap equivalent of a crossbow primed and aimed with its trigger tied to a string. I think that's really clever and not something I would think of. Plus, a good use of the illusory script spell that nobody freaking uses. So, just a cool idea of the way this takes, practical, intuitive, easy ideas and actually makes interesting traps out of it. And you can obviously use any scroll that you want for that kind of thing. So that's a lot of fun. And by the way, all these yellow sidebars are Calpurnia, in her voice basically saying all this, which allows the designer to give a bit more flavor and use a bit more casual language, which I think is really fun and effective. Because a lot of products on the DM's Guild tends to use, it's blanks so-and-so, and then that person isn't actually in the text at all. They're just there it's just on the cover, so it's like somebody just lent their name to it. But in this case, I really like when you see that character as an actual character in the text and be able to get that flavor text. So I think that's a lot of fun. The illusion traps I absolutely love. I thought these are really fun. As I mentioned, they used major image and programmed illusion are the main ones, just to fuck with the PCs basically and have some really fun ideas. One of them is to make an illusion of an animal that kind of runs out onto like a spike trap in a chasm, for example. And the idea is it's supposed to let the trick the PCs into thinking it's the spikes that are the illusion, whereas it's actually the little rat that's the illusion. And so they'll see that happen and be like, oh, okay, and they'll run out and jump on, jump over the chasm and fall on the spikes or something. So That's pretty fun. You could have an illusion of a spellcaster casting a spell in order to make your players mistakenly cast a counterspell, which is really fun. Just a lot of really cool ideas. The classic, like, just creepy child that runs out and, you know, triggers a trap. Lots of really good ideas for specifically illusion spells, which I think is my favorite section because, you know, a lot of the practical traps, probably ones you've already heard of or can already decide how they work and what's going on. It's nice to get rules for them, but I thought the magic traps had definitely the more clever ideas. Then we get into the entire adventure. So one thing I need to mention, you know, now that we're looking into it, is that the layout is just not very attractive. I actually went back and looked at my review for Calpurnia's magic items because it was by, you know, obviously the same designer, had the same very plain layout, and I did not mention that as a con. So I don't know if it's a question of the bar has been raised in the products I've reviewed since, I've become more curmudgeonly, or if this one does just have not as good of a layout, which I think it might be a combination of all three of those things, because Calpurnia's magic items had a lot of magic item art, which helps break up and add to the layout, whereas this one doesn't actually have a whole lot of artwork throughout. You know, I like the little drawings of the traps is nice, but you know, the black and white, the yellow sidebars, the very tiny text, all of that adds up to be a very non-attractive layout, which is a bummer. And you can even see here's the start of the adventure, and you wouldn't even know it just flipping through here. You'd think this was just another part of the traps until you start getting into, like, oh, wait a minute, there's a whole, you know, freaking hex crawl grid here, and what's going on? You have to go back and, like, oh, there's the start of an adventure. You know, there's no even, like, header image here. So, bummer about the layout. The adventure, which, again, is crazy that we even get a full adventure in what is a guide to traps, is okay. It has a fine start. There's a trap. There's an island nearby. It's really weird that there's a town right there, and you go into the, like, you cross a bridge into the island, and the townspeople can't even give you a map of their own island they're right next to. I thought that was bizarre. And the idea is you're hunting down this person who has wronged this noble in town, basically as a bounty on this gorilla ranger guy's head. Gorilla as in G-U-E, you know. And you're supposed to track him and his crew, although you don't know he's got a crew, in this island. And they're very good at setting up traps. This would basically be the crew that would fight back against, you know, the Predator or something. That's not a bad setup. The problem is turning it into a hex crawl is a total slog, because you're supposed to go through each of these hexes, and there's all kinds of random encounters, including just a bunch of, you know, random wildlife and the occasional traps and stuff. There are certain scripted areas, which are denoted here by the letters, where events happen. So there's a little pass here where there's just, it's actually insane. There's this one. There's 100. That's actually more than that. It's 1 square equals 50 feet, so whatever that adds up to right there. And every, like, it's 400 feet. There we go, 400 feet by 400 feet. And there's just supposed to be pit traps everywhere. And it even has this insane rule where there's a chance of a trap being in any 5 foot of movement or a 5 foot square if you're using a grid. The chance is equal to 1% plus 1% per average level of the PCs. Level 3 party would therefore use a 4% chance. No, don't do any of that. That's insane. So I don't like the approach to having just mass traps all over this huge island that's a hex crawl. It's like, you know, if you want to make Fireball Island, do Fireball Island, but that's not necessarily what this is. And unfortunately, you lose all of the story hook stuff because you just slog your way through, you know, they're called the Spectres, the enemy forces, kind of take pot shots at you, but otherwise there's basically no story advancement until you randomly locate where the actual base is, which is, of course, in the back corner of this entire hex grid. There's actually a fake one up here, which is kind of effective in a bear cave, where there's an alarm that sets off a bear that runs out and attacks you. So there are some individual neat moments and scripted events. There's a flaming ball trap that happens on this mountainside as you try to climb up. Obviously, the actual mine, the old abandoned mine, which is where they're holed up, is full of different traps. You know, there are some individual good scripted events, but I think trying to turn this into a huge hex crawl is a mistake. I think it's too much of a slog. It'll slow people down. And boy, if you have a caveat in the beginning of your adventure that's like, hey, warning, your players may not have fun in this adventure, maybe think about redesigning that adventure a little bit. I'm trying to find where it says that, but it even does mention the fact that this is a Here we go. Some players will enjoy chasing such a canny foe and will rise to the challenge. Others will find the experience demoralizing and frustrating, feeling helpless in a scenario which seems rigged against them. Consider whether your players would enjoy this adventure before running it. If you do go ahead, you might want to mentally prepare your players. The spoiler-free warning about the adventure's challenging nature. So, if you have to give that much of a caveat, then maybe you need to rethink designing this overall adventure. I mean, I like the idea of having a trap-focused adventure in your trap guide. That makes a lot of sense, and I think it can be very effective. I just think that this swings too much into... it's just biting off more than it can chew. Trying to turn that concept into a full-on island hex crawl just seems like a pain in the ass, and there's not like this individual, story moments and side quests and stuff. You're just getting pelted and attacked and have to deal with this shit constantly. And by, the third scripted event, and speaking from my experience at least, my players would be fucking sick of it. Like, it's just like, they'd be like, fuck it, somebody else can take care of this problem. If I were designing trap-focused adventures, I would take cues from 2 different movies. One of them, you are trying to attack somebody who's holed up in a house or a mansion or somewhere, and they've got a whole bunch of traps rigged that you have to get by, but make them a little more, some of them can be a little zany, and yes, I'm totally stealing from Home Alone in this case, where you're trying to get somebody and they just have a bunch of, traps set up and you have to make it through, and of course it's non-linear. There's different houses. You can go in the basement or go in through, the front door, the back door, whatever, and just totally do Home Alone, except you're the invaders at that point. Or make it so that there's a monster after you, and you've got either a wilderness area or an urban area, and you've got a lot of materials that you can use to basically fortify and craft and defend your area, and make it either one monster or a horde monster. So basically either do Predator or do like a zombie film, and make it so your players are on the defensive side and have to then make all these traps and, make sure there's all these, opportunities for them to make traps and all that. Those are 2 different, and those are very, mini adventures. Those are basically single scenarios, but those would be examples of ways to make adventures that are centered around traps that don't end up being a big, gigantic hex crawl thing. I mean, honestly, the concept of this adventure isn't bad if you took away the constant traps thing and just make this, maybe not even necessarily tied to the trap thing. So it's almost unfortunate this is not a super bad adventure the way it was crafted, but then trying to make it like, okay, we need to focus on traps now and have them all, doing traps constantly on the players. That's what makes it a bit of a slog. And then just the actual end part here, which I do like that the story does have some shades of gray at the end, although again, you're not going to get any story until you actually get to the end. But it's, the one guy's like dying from a cough because the noble struck him with a wand of contagion, and there's a lot of nice little shades of gray where the enemies are actually like mercenary heroes. So I did like that part of it, but it's just kind of too little too late at that point for the role-playing and story aspect. And you can see here pages and pages of random encounters that just feel like a total slog when it literally says you're supposed to have a random encounter like every single hex. Like, that's just nuts. Alright, let's go over my pros and cons for Calpurnia's Guide to Practical Traps. Pros: I love the way it's organized. We get individual bookmarks, and each trap is organized into their type. So primitive traps, mechanical traps, alchemical traps, etc. I really like that way it's organized. Pro: trap details include countermeasures, crafting, triggers, and optional variants. Extremely detailed. Pro: clever illusion-based trap ideas. I particularly love the illusion traps. I think they're very fun and a good way to jack with your players. Pro: there's an entire 20-plus page adventure that utilizes plenty of practical traps. Obviously, I'll mention the adventure again in my cons, but I do like the fact that we just got the adventure. Pros: insightful commentary by Calpurnia. I like that. Once again, Calpurnia is here, and that's something I liked in the previous Calpurnia's magical items that are reviewed, is that she's actually a voice that is used throughout, providing nice flavor text. Cons: the hex crawl trap adventure just looks like a slog. It's just too much. It's not something I would want to subject any players to. It would be that constantly hex crawls are very you have to be very careful in general, and they'll wear out their welcome very quickly, and in this case constantly throwing traps and combat at your players is a good way to just tear the whole adventure down. And then cons: it's unattractive layout. It's just more glaring here than it was before. Again, some of that is me, some of that is everybody making better layouts, but some of this is that I don't think this cuts the mustard anymore, essentially. Like, we need more artwork. The art needs to be better embedded in the pages. I don't think the black and white works well, and the very tiny text along with the kind of bright yellow sidebars, like just none of that makes things, makes the product look very attractive. Final verdict: with dozens of detailed yet intuitive trap designs, crafting rules, and an entire trap-focused mini-adventure, Calpurnia's Guide to Practical Traps is an excellent addition to any DM's toolbox. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. You can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.